Every night, with near-perfect reliability, your brain manufactures a world, not a dim or partial one, a complete sensory environment with color and sound and weight, people who talk to you, places you move through, all of it running without any instruction from you, and none of it real. And while it is happening, every part of your mind that would normally notice something is wrong is switched off. The region behind your forehead that compares experience to expectation, that asks whether this makes sense, that marks the difference between what is possible and what is not, goes quiet. What remains is a brain running at full speed, believing everything it generates with nobody left to check the work. This happens to you for roughly 2 hours every single night. If you live an average life, that adds to something close to 6 years spent inside experiences that never occurred. 6 years of running from things that cannot touch you, speaking to people who are not there, waking up in rooms you have never visited. 6 years that you have largely forgotten because the machinery that files memories away stops working the moment dreaming starts. The brain that spent 2 hours building an entire world wakes up having kept almost none of it, and the world it built was convincing. That is the part that should slow you down. When you are inside a dream, you do not experience it as a slightly odd internal movie. You experience it as being somewhere. The smell of a room, the texture of a wall under your hand, the weight of a body you are running with, the exact tone of a voice. All of it arrives with the same density as the waking world, because the same parts of the brain that process reality are the ones producing this. Your visual cortex fires during a dream in a pattern so close to how it fires when you are actually looking at something that the difference is difficult to measure. The brain is not simulating experience, it is generating it. How and why are not the same question. So here is what stays strange once you look directly at it. Every night, the most sophisticated object in the known universe devotes 2 hours to generating a fully inhabited world, with no apparent stimulus and no apparent plan, in a state where it cannot fact-check its own output. The experience is convincing beyond anything waking life produces. The forgetting is nearly total. And the reason for all of it, what the dream is for and why the brain produces it at all, remains one of the most genuinely open questions in neuroscience. Why would a brain that has refined itself over hundreds of millions of years spend a quarter of your sleeping time generating experiences you cannot use and will not remember? Why does the content of those experiences so reliably skew toward things that frighten or move you, rather than toward the neutral events that fill most of your waking hours? And why, of all the things the dreaming brain could have switched off, did it choose the one part that would have noticed? If you enjoy following questions about your own mind into places you did not expect, a like would be highly appreciated, and it genuinely helps these quiet explorations reach the people who want them. And if a dream has stayed with you recently, something you woke from and could not quite shake, the comments are there for exactly that. Now let's begin. The dreaming does not begin randomly. It is triggered. And the thing that triggers it is a chemistry so precise that researchers, once they understood it, found they could switch dreaming on and off in animals simply by shifting which molecules were present in a handful of cells the size of a grain of rice. Those cells sit in the oldest part of your brain, near the place where the skull meets the top of the spine. This region is not new. It predates language by hundreds of millions of years, predates the cortex you think with, predates almost everything that makes a human mind what it is. It regulates breathing and heartbeat and the basic rhythms of sleep, and somewhere in its depths, a set of neurons sits quietly loaded, waiting for the right conditions to fire. During the hours you are awake, two populations of cells hold those neurons in check. One population uses a molecule called norepinephrine. The other uses serotonin. Both fire steadily throughout the waking day, and their combined output acts as a kind of chemical brake on the dream-generating machinery. While they are active, dreaming cannot begin. The brake is always on. As you sleep, something shifts. Through the first hours of the night, in the deep, quiet stages of slow-wave sleep, those braking neurons gradually slow their own firing. Norepinephrine drops. Serotonin drops. The chemical pressure holding the dream machinery back begins to ease, and when it drops low enough, a different population of cells releases from the brake and begins to fire. These cells use a different molecule entirely. They use acetylcholine, and the moment they open, everything changes. The acetylcholine surge does several things at nearly the same time. It tells the spinal cord to cut the signals reaching the muscles of your arms and legs, which is why you lie still while the dream runs. It sends a burst of activity toward the circuits that move the eyes, which is why they dart and scan behind closed lids, following a world no one else can see. And it sets off something closer to a pulse than a wave, electrical activity that starts in the brainstem and travels upward through the brain, reaching all the way to the visual cortex at the back of the skull. That pulse repeats. It fires roughly once every second or two throughout the entire period of dreaming, like a signal that never quite stops knocking. And what it does when it arrives is where the dream begins. The brain now running the dream is not in an unusual or degraded state. By almost every measure, it is at its most active. Blood flow is high. Neurons are firing at rates that match or exceed those of full wakefulness. The visual cortex is processing. The emotional processing regions are loud. The motor cortex has the body planned for movement, even if the movement is blocked at the spinal cord. This is not a brain at rest. It is a brain working extremely hard at something, and the acetylcholine is the chemical that started it all. The pulse traveling upward from the brainstem is not carrying a message. It is not encoding light or sound or a particular sensation from the outside world. It is random noise, generated from inside. The brainstem fires it without reference to anything. It does not know what the dreaming brain will do with it. It has no content. It is raw activation, arriving in regions that exist to turn activation into experience, carrying nothing but the electrical fact of itself. And those regions receive it the way they always do. They do the one thing they are built for. They try to make sense of what they are given. Out of that effort comes the dream. The nature of that effort and what exactly the cortex does with noise is what divided sleep researchers for decades. A researcher named J. Allen Hobson spent much of his career making that argument against fierce resistance. He was a psychiatrist at Harvard. What he was arguing against was a century of psychoanalytic tradition, the idea that dreams are meaningful the way a symbol is meaningful, carrying disguised wishes and buried conflicts up from the unconscious into the sleeping mind. Hobson did not find that convincing. He found it unfalsifiable and, worse, neurologically incoherent. The activation coming out of the brainstem, he insisted, was not organized. It was not carrying content that the cortex was disguising. It was noise. The cortex was not a sensor. It was a narrator, and the story it told from the noise was the dream. He published this argument in 1977 with his colleague Robert McCarley in a paper that proposed what they called the activation synthesis hypothesis. The scientific establishment was, in places, furious. Hobson had challenged a framework with enormous cultural prestige using hard cellular evidence, and he did not soften the message for his audience. The argument was blunt. Dreams are not messages from the unconscious. They are the brain doing the only thing it can do with spontaneous activation, trying to build something coherent out of it. Hobson was right in a way that turned out to be more complicated than he knew. But the core of the argument, that something specific in the brainstem generates the raw conditions of dreaming, and that the cortex then assembles them into experience, has held up in every subsequent scan and recording. The dream begins not in the mind, but in a cluster of cells at the base of the brain, running a chemistry that is almost as old as sleep itself. That pulse has a name, and the name is a map. PGO stands for 3 points along the path the signal takes: the pons, the lateral geniculate nucleus, and the occipital cortex. The pons is the knot of brainstem tissue where the signal originates. The lateral geniculate nucleus is a relay station in the center of the brain that ordinarily handles visual signals coming in from the eyes. The occipital cortex is the visual processing region at the back of the skull. The wave, in other words, travels the road that visual information travels. It does not knock on auditory cortex first. It does not reach language areas before it reaches the visual system. It targets vision specifically. And that is not accidental. Under ordinary waking conditions, the lateral geniculate nucleus is a faithful middleman. Light hits the retinas. The retinas encode it as electrical signals. Those signals arrive at the relay, which forwards them upward to the occipital cortex, where the processing that produces visual experience begins. The system is built to take its input from the eyes. During REM, though, the eyes are sealed behind their lids. The signals from the retinas are quiet. The relay receives its activation from below instead of from the eyes. The pons fires upward, the relay passes it on, and the visual cortex begins processing as if real visual input had arrived. Because from where the cortex sits, something that looks a great deal like real visual input has arrived. The signal has the same general character. The cortex cannot tell the difference between the two, and it does not try. It processes what it receives. This is why the visual experience of dreaming is so dominant and so concrete. You do not dream in vague impressions. You dream in rooms, in streets, in faces with particular expressions. The scenes have depth and color and light. Things have weight and distance. The visual cortex is doing what it does all day, constructing a spatial world from a stream of electrical signals, and the fact that the signal this time originated in the brainstem rather than the retina does not change the output. The output is a world. Other senses appear in dreams, but they do not anchor the scene the way vision does. Hearing comes through sometimes, the sound of a particular voice or a piece of music that does not exist. Touch arrives less often. Taste and smell are rare. The proportions of sensory experience in dreams map closely onto the proportions of PGO wave activity across the corresponding cortical regions. What gets hit hardest is what gets experienced most vividly. The visual system gets hit hardest. While the visual cortex processes the arriving noise, two other structures come alive in ways that shape what the dream becomes. One is the amygdala. During slow-wave sleep, it was relatively quiet. When the REM window opens and acetylcholine surges through the brain, the amygdala becomes one of the loudest structures in the dreaming system. It is involved in registering emotional significance, in recognizing threat, in marking experience with feeling. When it fires during dreaming, the dream acquires emotional texture that does not require any external event to justify it. Fear can arrive without a predator. Longing can arrive without a face. The amygdala adds the feeler first, and the dreaming brain constructs whatever experience fits it. The other structure that becomes active is the hippocampus. During waking, the hippocampus plays a central role in binding new events into memory, helping to organize and index recent experience. During REM, it does not shut down. It stays engaged, contributing activation of its own to the dreaming system. The patterns it sends into the network carry information from what has already been stored. This is one of the reasons that dream content draws so heavily from your own life. The material it activates is yours. The hippocampus is not filing things quietly while the rest of the brain hallucinates. It is part of the noise. At the same time, a region that would ordinarily manage the quality of your own thinking becomes much less involved. The prefrontal cortex sits behind the forehead. It is central to logical evaluation, reality monitoring, and the sense that something does not quite add up. It shows substantially reduced blood flow during REM. While you are awake, this system would notice that a person had your grandmother's voice but a stranger's face. It would notice that the building you are inside does not obey the rules of buildings. During REM, it is not running at its usual level. This is why the dream feels real while it runs. The machinery that checks for consistency is partially offline, and without it, anything the brain assembles goes unchallenged. Into that landscape, the PGO wave arrives again, and again, and again. The visual cortex ready, the amygdala running hot, the hippocampus offering up fragments from the archive, the prefrontal cortex not quite maintaining the oversight that would expose the whole thing as constructed. The brainstem fires its pulse, and the assembled system does what it always does. It builds an experience, not because the signal instructed it to build a particular one, because building experience from incoming activation is the only thing it knows how to do. When signal arrives in the cortex, there's no process that simply logs it and moves on. The cortex does not receive input the way a microphone receives sound. It is not a passive recorder. What it does instead is generate a prediction about what the input should be, compare the actual signal to that prediction, and update its model of the world accordingly. This is what the cortex does all the time, while you are awake and reading and walking down a street. It is a prediction engine that uses incoming signals to continuously refine its own account of what is happening. In waking, that engine is tightly constrained. Every prediction it generates is almost immediately tested against real sensory data. The model says there should be a door there, and either there is a door there or there is not, and the discrepancy is felt, and the model updates toward what is actually present. The world disciplines the model. Errors get corrected before they compound. The result is a working account of reality that stays fairly close to what is actually there. During REM, the sensory data is gone. The eyes are sealed. The auditory cortex is not receiving sounds from outside. The signals from the skin and the body are muted. What arrives instead are the PGO pulses from the brainstem, carrying nothing in particular. But the prediction engine does not know this. It has been generating predictions and receiving signals for the entire duration of waking life, and it continues doing what it has always done. It generates a prediction. It compares it to what arrived. It updates. It generates another prediction. Without external data to discipline that process, the model is built almost entirely from the inside. The cortex draws on the patterns it already contains and the memories the hippocampus is currently offering. It draws on the emotional charge arriving from the amygdala and the most recent concerns from waking life. From those materials, it assembles the best account it can of what the arriving signals mean. That account is the dream. The reason this matters is that the cortex does not know it is working without external data. It is not aware that its source has changed. It builds the dream with exactly the same confidence it brings to building a perception of the waking room. This is why the dream feels real. The same machinery that constructs waking experience is constructing this one, using the same process and with the same certainty. The difference is only in what the machinery is working from. What determines the specific content of a given dream follows from what the cortex has available to draw on. Emotional state shapes it. A brain running a high amygdala tends to construct scenes that carry the emotional signature already present, which is why threatening events and charged interactions appear in dreams far more than their frequency in waking life would predict. Recent experience shapes it. A concern that occupied your attention during the day leaves an active pattern in the network, and the synthesizing cortex reaches for patterns that are already lit. Memory shapes it. The hippocampus offers up fragments from the archive, not as orderly recall, but as activated pieces, which the narrative tries to incorporate wherever they fit. The result is a story. Not a planned one, and not a coherent one in every detail, but a story with characters and places and a felt sense of continuity. Events happen for reasons, even if the reasons shift or evaporate. Spaces have geography, even if the geography is impossible. The narrative register that is running throughout the dream is your narrative register. You are surprised by things, you respond to things, you want things. The response is real. The wanting is real. What generates the occasion for those responses is constructed by a brain working without external reference, but the responses themselves are genuine processes. The strangeness that makes dreams memorable is not separate from this synthesis. It is the same synthesis, running without constraint. When the waking brain builds a perception and something in the input conflicts with the model, the conflict registers as wrongness, and the model corrects toward what is actually there. During the dream, there is no independent check on the model. When two patterns are both available and both partially fit the arriving signal, the brain can activate both at once. A person becomes two people. A room shifts into another room without transition. Someone speaks in a voice that does not match their face. These are not errors in the synthesis. They are what synthesis looks like when it is free to draw from anywhere, and nothing on the outside insists that it correct itself. A later refinement of this account, developed with Carl Friston in 2012, described the dreaming brain not as a synthesizer, responding to noise, but as a generative model running offline. During waking, the brain runs a constant internal simulation of the world and updates it against sensory data. During REM, the incoming sensory data drops to near zero. The simulation keeps running. Without the corrective pressure of the outside world, the simulation generates its own scenery and its own events. It creates its own occasions for surprise. The dream is not a response to noise. It is what the brain's world model does when the world is no longer there to check it. Both accounts arrive at the same place. The dream does not begin as a message or a meaning. It begins as a physical process in the brainstem, producing random activation, aimed at a cortex that is going to make sense of whatever arrives. The sense it makes is the dream. The story that results is real in every way that matters to the person inside it. Its raw material was electrical noise. The sense it appears to carry was assembled on the fly by a brain that had no choice but to try. The dreamer does not question the dream. The person whose childhood home now has extra hallways it never had does not notice anything wrong. The person whose dead grandmother is sitting at the kitchen table discussing something trivial does not find this unusual. The person who is flying over a city that is partly London and partly a place they have never visited accepts the geography completely. Each of these, while it runs, is received as simply true. As what is happening, understanding why requires going one level deeper into what the prefrontal cortex actually does during waking. One of its primary functions is reality monitoring, the continuous evaluation of whether what you are experiencing originates in the external world or in your own mind. You can close your eyes and imagine the color red. The image of red arrives in your visual processing system, but the prefrontal cortex, running alongside, tags that image as internally generated. It maintains the distinction between percept and imagination, between what is real and what you are producing. Without that tagging process running cleanly, the distinction collapses. During REM, the tagging process is not running. The visual cortex is processing genuine activity and receiving it with full intensity. The amygdala is responding to it as though it carried genuine stakes, and the system that would normally mark the experience as internally generated is substantially offline. The dream image arrives with the same weight and urgency as a real percept, because nothing is present to mark it as anything else. There is a second mechanism, subtler than the first. Working memory, the system that holds the current moment in relation to the moments just before it, depends on norepinephrine to maintain its activity in the prefrontal cortex. Without norepinephrine, the representations it maintains do not persist. What this means in practice is that in REM, the scene you are currently in cannot easily be held in relation to the scene you were just in. Each dream moment arrives as if it were the only moment. Each scene is, from the perspective of the dreaming system, the world. Not a continuation of anything before, just the world, the present world, the only world currently running. This is why impossible transitions do not disturb the dreamer. The building that now has a different floor plan is not noticed as having changed, because the memory of the old floor plan is not available for comparison. The person whose face shifts between two different people is not noticed as shifting, because the prior state is not being held against the current one. The dream does not explain its inconsistencies, because no system is operating that would require an explanation. Research collecting dream reports on waking from REM found something that follows directly from this. In ordinary waking daydreams, more than 1 in 5 episodes includes some instance of the person thinking about their own mental state, noticing that they are imagining, registering that the content is content rather than reality. In dream reports, instances of this kind of self-reflection occur in fewer than 1 in 100 cases. The dreamer is almost entirely absorbed in the dream as direct experience, with no reflective distance from it at all. The feeling inside the dream is accordingly real in a way that the content is not. When you're afraid in the dream, the fear is produced by genuine amygdala activation and genuine physiological response. The urgency is real. The fear does not know it has no external cause. The longing does not know there is nothing actually there to long for. The emotional machinery is running fully. Only the occasion for it is constructed. Waking from a vivid dream can feel genuinely disorienting, and the reason is the same. The experience that just ended was real in every dimension your nervous system uses to evaluate reality. It had visual detail and emotional weight and spatial coherence. It had felt continuity from one moment to the next. The realization that it was constructed rather than given does not come from the dream itself. It arrives from the first data of waking, the ceiling, the quality of the light, and the sound in the room. It arrives in the weight of your body in the bed and the slow return of the tagging system that can now mark what just happened as having been produced from inside. What that system finds when it comes back online is not nothing. What you dreamed was not empty. The images were vivid. The emotions were real. The people had faces and voices. Something was made there, out of noise, and it had weight. Only its source turns out to have been somewhere different than it seemed. There is a further layer to this. The emotional system does not require the prefrontal cortex's participation to generate responses. Fear and grief and longing are produced by subcortical structures that operate independently of prefrontal input. The amygdala does not ask the prefrontal cortex for permission before generating an alarm signal. During waking, the prefrontal cortex is in constant dialogue with the amygdala. It modulates its outputs and regulates how intensely the response is expressed. During REM, that modulation is reduced. The amygdala is left to run at something closer to its own baseline, which is higher than the regulated waking version. Dream emotions are often more intense than the waking emotions of comparable situations. The events that generate them would not produce such a strong response in waking life. The person in the dream who says something mildly critical produces a wave of shame that is out of proportion to what the actual words would have produced awake. The scene that carries an ambiguous threat produces genuine terror. The dreaming emotional system is running louder, and the regulatory mechanism that would bring it into proportion with reality is substantially offline. The experience of waking from a dream mid-process carries its own evidence. The emotional residue of a vivid dream can last into waking for minutes or hours. Elevated heart rate and increased skin conductance have been measured in sleepers during REM and persist into the first minutes of waking when people are roused from vivid emotional dreams. The body is not separate from the dream. It was part of it, and it does not reset instantly when the dream ends. The dream is not a mental event that happens to produce a physical response. The physical response is constitutive of the dream. The raised heart rate and physiological urgency and hormonal response to threat or loss are what make the dream what it is. They are not incidental to the experience. They are the experience as much as the images are. Specific content does appear in dreams, and it is not arbitrary. The brainstem signal that starts the process is random. What the cortex builds from it is not. The material comes from a particular life, and researchers who spent decades collecting and cataloguing dream reports found it follows identifiable patterns, consistent enough across individuals and cultures to be counted and compared. The most detailed framework for doing this came from Calvin Hall and Robert van der Castle, who built a systematic coding system for dream reports. They assigned every element to a category: who appears, where the scene is set, and what emotion colors it. When that coding system is applied to large collections of dream reports, the same features emerge again and again. Dreams are predominantly social. The majority of dream scenes involve other people rather than being solitary. Characters include people the dreamer knows, and strangers appearing at a higher rate than in waking social life. A smaller proportion includes figures from fiction or the remote past. The scale of this cataloguing effort became possible because Hall developed the coding system not as a personal project, but as a scientific protocol. He and van der Castle trained coders to apply the categories independently and measured their agreement, producing a system that other researchers could use on their own collections without reference to Hall himself. By the time the key findings were synthesized, the dataset behind them ran to tens of thousands of individual dream reports from participants across multiple countries, collected under varied conditions but yielding findings that proved robust across all of them. The settings dreams choose are mostly ordinary: domestic spaces, familiar public places, buildings the dreamer recognizes or almost recognizes, outdoor environments that carry the general character of places known. The unusual geography and impossible architecture stand out precisely because they contrast with a background of settings that feel entirely plausible. The unremarkable dream, the one forgotten by breakfast, is set in a recognizable place and involves the kind of social scenario the dreamer encounters regularly. Social interactions in dreams tend toward conflict and aggression at a rate that Hall and Van der Castle found consistently higher than social encounters that are friendly or cooperative. The ratio varies depending on the sample and the method of collection, but across collections the direction holds. When dream characters interact, they are more often in conflict than collaboration. This is not uniform across all dreamers. People in stable, positively weighted social lives show different content distributions than people whose waking relationships are difficult. But the baseline, across populations, favors conflict over cooperation. Dream settings also reflect the familiar with unusual fidelity. Researchers who have asked participants to describe the settings of their dreams in enough detail to identify the real place they resemble find that the majority can be matched to a known location: a childhood home, a school, or a neighborhood the dreamer has lived in. The dream architecture may be wrong in specific ways: doors in the wrong places or rooms that connect in impossible sequences, but the underlying geography is drawn from somewhere real. The brain is not inventing from nothing, it is modifying what it already has. The emotional register is skewed. Analyses of dream reports consistently find negative effect appearing more often than positive. Anxiety, fear, and loss outweigh joy. Whatever the dream is doing with emotional material, it is not sampling it proportionally from daily life. What the dream does sample proportionally are the things that currently occupy you. This is the central finding of the continuity hypothesis, developed extensively by the psychologist G. William Domhoff. The content of your dreams across time tracks the content of your waking concerns. A person preoccupied with work encounters work situations in dreams. A person going through a relationship difficulty encounters versions of that relationship in dreams. An athlete in intensive training reports dreams structured around physical performance. The correlation is not perfect, and individual dreams are not direct translations of waking life. But across enough dream reports, the shape of a person's dream content maps recognizably onto the shape of their waking preoccupations. This is the finding that most directly connects dream science to ordinary daily experience. A person who is grieving, for instance, tends to dream about the person they have lost more often in the weeks immediately following the loss, and less often as time passes. A person who is preparing intensively for an exam reports more exam-related dream content during the preparation period. A writer working deeply on a project encounters material from that project in their dreams at a rate that exceeds chance. The dreaming brain is not keeping its distance from waking life. It is running alongside waking life, processing the same material and drawing on the same preoccupations, reflecting back a version of what the waking person is living through. The content of your dreams is not generated by forces alien to you. It is generated by the particular configuration of what you care about, what worries you, and what you have recently experienced. The random signal from the brainstem sets the process in motion. The cortex chooses its material from what the hippocampus and the amygdala have available, and what those regions have available is a function of your life. Why this happens follows from what is happening in the brain during REM. The hippocampus is active and offering up patterns from the archive. The amygdala is running high and amplifying emotionally significant material. The cortex is building its model from what is most readily available and most recently activated. The concerns that occupied you during the day left traces in the network. The patterns for people you see regularly are more deeply etched than patterns for strangers. The scenarios you have replayed or worried over are lit more brightly than scenarios you have forgotten. The dream does not draw from a neutral inventory of everything you have ever experienced. It draws from what is currently live in the network, what matters to you, what worries you, and what remains unresolved. The result is a dream life that is recognizably yours. Other people report their dreams as familiar too, even when the events in them are impossible. The people have their people in them. The buildings have elements of their buildings in them. The anxieties are their anxieties, wearing particular costumes. The emotional texture is continuous with waking life even when the narrative content is not. What the dream borrows from is the accumulated material of a particular consciousness, activated by a random signal, assembled by a cortex that does the best it can with what it finds. Among all the features of dream content that show up consistently in the data, the one that has most interested researchers is the disproportionate presence of threat. Dreams contain threatening events far more often than their frequency in waking life would predict. They contain physical danger, social conflict, and pursuit. Loss and failure appear at a rate that sits well above the baseline of ordinary daily experience. The most thorough analyses of large dream report collections find that somewhere around 4 in 5 dream emotions are negative. This is not a sample size artifact. It is a consistent finding, replicated across different populations and different methods. A Finnish researcher named Antti Revonsuo noticed this pattern and asked a question that opened a different way of thinking about what dreaming is for. Threats appear in dreams far more often than in waking life, and the emotional responses they produce, the fear and the vigilance, are neurologically real even when the threat is not. What is this doing? What is the function of producing threat experiences in a safe environment, over and over, across a lifetime of sleep? The analogy is to training. A fire drill is not a fire. A combat simulation is not combat. But both produce real physiological preparation and real improvement in performance when the real event occurs. The dreaming system, on this account, is running its own form of drill. The threat that appears in the dream is not present. What it trains is real: threat recognition, the fear response, and the decision about whether to run or confront. These carry forward into waking readiness. His answer, published in the year 2000 in the journal Behavioral and Brain Sciences, was threat simulation theory. The central claim was evolutionary. Dreams, on this account, are not a side effect of REM. They are a mechanism. Specifically, they are a mechanism for practicing threat perception and threat response at zero real-world cost. The dreaming brain runs simulations of threatening situations, trains the systems that would respond to those situations, and rehearses recognition and action without any of the physical consequences that real threats carry. The ancestral environment was dangerous. Predators were real. Social conflicts had mortal stakes. an organism that could rehearse its responses to these situations while safe in sleep and improve its readiness for them, would have an advantage over one that could not. Several observations fit this account. Threatening dream themes appear across cultures at similar rates, which is consistent with an evolved mechanism rather than a culturally acquired one. The themes include pursuit, predation, and natural catastrophe. Children's dream reports contain proportionally more threats than adults, which makes sense if the system front-loads its rehearsal during the developmental period when survival skills are most urgently being established. Post-traumatic stress produces intense and repetitive dream reenactment of threatening experiences. On this account, it looks like a system stuck in a drill it cannot complete. Many dreams are neutral or mildly positive. The system runs the simulation most urgently when threat material is available and emotionally activated. When the emotional system is running quieter, the dream builds from whatever else is available, and the content reflects that. The theory's claim is about the baseline rate across a lifetime of dreaming, not about every individual dream. What threat simulation theory proposes is that the function of dreaming and the mechanism of dreaming can be separated. Hobson and McCarley were right that the brainstem trigger is random noise, not a curated selection of threats. But the cortex that receives that noise is not a passive synthesizer. It is a system shaped by evolution to build particular kind of experience preferentially. When it has emotionally charged material available, when the amygdala is running high and threat-relevant patterns are active, it reaches for those patterns first. The noise from the brainstem is the occasion. What the brain builds from it may be something much older than the noise. The theory also makes a specific prediction about the content of dreams, which is that they should disproportionately represent the categories of threat that were most fitness relevant in ancestral environments. Predatory pursuit, physical aggression, social exclusion, natural hazards. These are not the threats that most people living in modern cities face on a daily basis, but they are exactly the threats that dominate dream content across cultures. The mismatch between the modern world and the dream world is, on this account, not a mismatch at all. It is evidence that the system is running an ancient program that has not been updated for the current environment. Revonsuo's account also extends to explain why trauma so reliably produces repetitive nightmares. A real threat that left the threat response system in an activated state would produce exactly what is observed in trauma. Dreams that reenact the threatening event, not as memory replay but as simulation. The system is trying to complete the drill. In ordinary dreaming, the simulated threat resolves. You escape or confront, and the scene ends. In post-traumatic dreaming, the resolution fails, and the dream cycles back. The waking application of this, the readied threat response, never fires because the real event is past. The simulation keeps running, and while it runs, it is doing something to the emotional material it passes through. Something unusual is happening in the chemistry of the dreaming state. During waking, norepinephrine is present throughout the system. It supports focused attention, sharpens responses, and reinforces the formation of emotionally charged memories. A frightening event while awake is frightening partly because of the norepinephrine flooding the system at the same moment. The norepinephrine becomes part of the memory. The emotional charge that makes a memory difficult to forget is, in part, a chemical stamp. During REM, norepinephrine drops to near zero. It is one of the defining features of the REM state. The amygdala is still active, still processing emotionally significant material, but it is doing so in the near total absence of norepinephrine. This produces a condition that has no waking equivalent, emotional memory traces being reactivated in a system that lacks the chemistry ordinarily associated with emotional arousal. Matthew Walker, a sleep researcher at the University of California, Berkeley, proposed that this combination does something specific to those memories. He called it sleep to forget, sleep to remember. The hypothesis holds that REM reactivates emotionally charged memories while simultaneously allowing the emotional tone attached to them to diminish. The content of the memory is preserved and consolidated. The distress associated with it is reduced. The experience is replayed without the full neurochemical context that made it painful. Each replay across successive REM periods strips a little more of the charge from the memory while leaving its informational content intact. The clinical evidence for something like this comes partly from work on depression and grief. Rosalind Cartwright, a psychologist at Rush University, followed people going through divorce. Some developed depression and some did not. She found that those who reported dreaming about the divorce and who incorporated their former partners into their dreams in complex ways rather than being absent from them showed better psychological recovery over the following year. Those whose dreams showed no engagement with the difficult material fared worse. Those who dreamed about the difficult material and found their former partners appearing in altered contexts recovered more completely. They saw the situation refracted during sleep and fared better in the year that followed. REM deprivation, in Walker's studies, produces the opposite effect. People whose REM is selectively interrupted while other sleep stages are preserved become more emotionally reactive during the following day. Their responses to emotionally charged images and social situations are stronger than those of well-rested controls. Repeated nights of REM deprivation compound this, producing a measurable and progressive increase in emotional instability. The system that was managing emotional material during sleep is no longer doing so. The charge that would have been processed during the night carries forward intact. Dreaming during REM is not simply a byproduct of cortical processing of random noise. The specific neurochemical state of REM, active amygdala, and absent norepinephrine appears to be precisely the condition required for a particular kind of emotional work. The brain uses the physiological window of REM to do something to emotional memories that it cannot do in any other state, engage with them fully, in the absence of the chemistry that makes them painful, and gradually reduce the charge they carry. The function, if this account is right, is not entertainment. It is not narrative. It is maintenance. The dreaming brain is servicing the emotional archive, distinguishing what matters from what hurts about what matters, keeping the information and filing down the distress. The experiments behind the REM deprivation effect used a selective method that had to be developed specifically for this purpose. Standard sleep deprivation removes all sleep stages together and produces effects that cannot be attributed to any one of them. To isolate the effect of REM specifically, researchers used polysomnography to monitor the sleeping participant's brain in real time and woke them briefly at the moment REM began, before enough time had passed to produce meaningful sleep. The waking lasted only long enough to interrupt the state and was followed by immediate return to sleep. Participants accumulated normal amounts of slow-wave sleep, but very little REM. Their waking performance the next day showed the expected deficit in emotional regulation. Their responses to emotional images were stronger. Their recovery from unpleasant stimuli was slower. Their own reports of their emotional state were more reactive and more negative. Walker's account of why this happens returns to the neurochemistry. During each REM period, the emotionally significant memories of the recent past are represented to a system that is running without norepinephrine. The memory activates with its content intact. The emotional tone that norepinephrine helps stamp into it during the original experience is no longer supported by the chemistry that created it. The memory plays, the amygdala engages, but the charge is not reinforced. Across enough repetitions, across enough REM cycles, across enough nights, the memory retains its informational weight, but loses some of the distress that made it difficult to approach. The clinical implication is considerable. PTSD, one of the most debilitating consequences of traumatic experience, is characterized by an inability to process traumatic memories in the normal way. Patients often show disrupted REM sleep with fragmented REM architecture and elevated norepinephrine levels. On Walker's account, this elevation prevents the emotional attenuation process from completing. The nightmares are not simply re-experiencing, they are failed processing. The memory reactivates, but the chemistry does not allow the charge to diminish. Some pharmacological treatments for PTSD work specifically by reducing norepinephrine during sleep, and the reduction of nightmare frequency is one of their documented effects. This sits alongside the threat simulation account in an interesting way. If Ravonsuo is right that dreams rehearse threat response, and Walker is right that REM processes the emotional weight of experienced threats, then the two accounts may not be in conflict. The rehearsal system and the processing system may be the same system, running the same material for different purposes simultaneously or sequentially within the same night, and the same neurochemical state that makes both possible is doing something else alongside them. During REM, the brain is forming connections. The connections the dreaming brain makes are not the tight sequential connections of deliberate waking thought. They are something looser. Without norepinephrine, the filter that governs waking cognition drops. In waking, that filter keeps some associations immediately available and others at a distance. In the dreaming brain, that distance collapses. Norepinephrine enforces relevance when you are focused on a problem. Concepts closely related to it activate easily, and concepts far from it do not. The network is constrained by what is being asked of it. During REM, that constraint is gone. The cortex, saturated with acetylcholine and nearly empty of norepinephrine, runs in a mode that researchers call hyperassociative. Concepts that have no obvious relationship in waking thought can find each other in a dreaming brain. Memories that would never be retrieved together during deliberate recall can become simultaneously active and form novel connections. The associative field is wider than the waking version of the same network, and what gets found in that wider field are relationships that deliberate search would not locate. A series of experiments published in the journal Nature in 2004 by a team led by Ulrich Wagner tested whether this state produces something measurable in the form of insight. Participants were trained on a mathematical task that involved transforming sequences of digits using a set of rules. There was a hidden structure in the task, a shortcut that made the whole procedure considerably faster, but participants were not told about it. They had to discover it, if they discovered it at all. Some participants slept after training, others stayed awake. Those who slept were nearly 3 times more likely to find the shortcut during subsequent testing than those who had remained awake. The participants who slept had not been told to look for a shortcut. No one had indicated that one existed, but something during sleep had connected elements of what they had learned in a way that made the hidden structure visible when they returned to the task. The finding points toward a function that is entirely different from the threat rehearsal or the emotional processing accounts. The dreaming brain, in this view, is doing something closer to creative recombination. It is taking the materials of recent experience and running them together in combinations that waking thought would not produce. It is looking for patterns that the constrained waking mind would not find without knowing that it is looking. Insight, the sudden sense that something is obvious that was not obvious a moment before, is one of the outputs. Robert Stickgold, a sleep researcher at Harvard Medical School, described this mode as the brain making distant associative connections. During waking, the network tends to activate closely related concepts in tight clusters. During REM, the reach extends. A problem and a memory that would not normally activate each other can find themselves in the same active window. Any correspondence they share becomes suddenly apparent. This is not deliberate. It is not a function the sleeper controls. It is a property of the neurochemical state of REM, and it runs whether or not the sleeper has an unsolved problem waiting. The dream-making machinery is doing several things at the same time, and none of them are the same thing. The brainstem is firing random noise. The cortex is building the best narrative it can from that noise. The amygdala is processing and reprocessing emotionally significant material. The hippocampus is offering up fragments of stored experience. Across all of this, the hyper-associative state of the network is quietly finding connections. The waking mind will sometimes be able to use them when the day returns. The dream, the experience of it, is the surface. What is happening underneath the dream is more varied than the dream itself reveals. The Wagner study used a task specifically designed to be solvable by two routes: a slow rule-by-rule approach that worked but was laborious, and a fast shortcut that required noticing a pattern in the structure of the task that was not made explicit. Participants were trained to competence on the slow route and then tested after a period of sleep or waking. The difference in insight rates was large and consistent across replications. Sleep produced insight. Waking did not, or did so at a much lower rate. The finding was not simply that sleep improved performance generally. Performance on the slow route improved somewhat for both the sleeping and waking groups. The difference was specific to insight. The discovery that the slow route was unnecessary. This is a qualitative change in approach, not a quantitative improvement in execution. The sleeping brain had done something the waking brain had not, and what it had done was notice a relationship that the task's surface did not make obvious. Stickgold, working from a different angle, proposed that the associative reach during REM extends to semantically distant material in a way that waking cognition does not. In waking, the spread of activation through the semantic network follows a gradient determined by relevance and recency. In REM, the gradient flattens. Concepts that are connected by a long sequence of intermediate steps that would require several degrees of separation to reach from the target concept in waking thought become accessible in a single activation step during REM. This is not a metaphor for what happens in the dreaming brain. It is a mechanistic description of what the absence of norepinephrine does to the spread of cortical activation. The result, in experiential terms, is what people report as creative illumination upon waking. The sense that the problem that was intractable the night before has a solution that now seems obvious. The solution was not produced during sleep in the way a calculation is produced during waking. It was produced by the dream state brain forming a connection that the waking brain could then use. The dreamer woke to find the connection already made. This is one of the reasons that many people report that their best thinking happens just after waking, in the transitional state between sleep and full wakefulness. The hyper-associative mode of REM does not end instantly at the moment of waking. It persists for some time. The brain that has been forming distant connections all night is still forming them as it re-engages with the waking world, and the ideas that arrive in that transitional state are the product of a network still running in the mode that makes distant connections available. There is one condition under which the dreamer does become aware that they are dreaming while still inside the dream. The imagery stays vivid, the emotional register stays real, the scene continues to run, but something else has switched on. The dreamer knows with the same certainty as the dream itself that what they are experiencing is not the waking world. This is called lucid dreaming. It has been reported throughout recorded history in nearly every culture that has documented dream experience. For most of that history, it was described as a subjective phenomenon, verifiable only by the dreamer's report on waking. The question of whether it was real, in the sense of having a distinct neurological signature that could be measured, remained open. Stephen LaBerge at Stanford answered it in 1981 by finding a method to mark the moment of lucidity from the outside. Because the eyes move freely during REM, and because eye muscles are not paralyzed the way other muscles are, a dreamer who became lucid during REM could communicate with the outside world by moving their eyes in a pre-agreed pattern. LaBerge trained lucid dreamers to signal the moment of lucidity by performing a specific sequence of left-right eye movements. The eye movements were visible on the recording equipment monitoring the sleeper. The dreamer was in REM. The signal was real. Lucid dreaming had a timestamp. What the protocol made possible was not just verification, it opened a channel. A dreamer who had signaled the start of lucidity could be asked, through prior agreement, to perform tasks inside the dream and then signal their completion. Researchers could give a dreamer the task of counting to 10 inside the dream or performing a specific sequence of eye movements after a named interval and verify through the recording equipment that the task had been completed. The voluntary motor system was running. Deliberate action was possible. This meant that the lucid dream was not simply awareness with no consequence. The dreamer could direct their own experience and communicate results to the waking world. The gap between sleeping and waking had a narrow opening in it. Once the moment of lucidity could be pinned in time, researchers could look at what was happening in the brain at that exact transition. A team led by Ursula Voss used high-density electroencephalography and found that at the moment the dreamer became lucid, power at around 40 cycles per second increased selectively over the frontal scalp. This frequency is called the gamma band. It is associated in waking neuroscience with focused and coordinated processing. It is the rhythm of binding, of active attention, of the kind of processing the prefrontal cortex performs when it is engaged. Its appearance at the moment of lucidity, over the frontal region, pointed to something specific happening there. Subsequent imaging confirmed it. In an experiment by Martin Dressler and colleagues, participants were scanned while sleeping and asked to signal lucidity using the LaBerge eye movement protocol. At the moment the signal was sent, blood flow increased in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and in the precuneus, a region involved in self-awareness. The same regions that are suppressed during ordinary REM were coming back online, selectively, at the moment the dreamer became aware. This was useful, but it was still correlational. The question was whether prefrontal reactivation was causing the lucidity or accompanying it. Voss and colleagues addressed this in 2014 by applying electrical stimulation to the scalp of sleeping participants during natural REM. Stimulation at 40 cycles per second and not at other frequencies increased the likelihood that participants would report lucid features in their dreams. Stimulation drove the brain toward gamma synchrony in the frontal region. Gamma synchrony appeared to be sufficient to produce, at least partially, the conditions of lucid awareness. What emerges from these studies is a state of partial and selective re-engagement. The prefrontal cortex does not return as a unit. The regions that support self-referential processing and metacognition come back before those associated with deliberate planning or rational evaluation. What returns first is knowing and not reasoning. The dreamer who becomes lucid is aware before they are fully clear about anything. Knowledge arrives before clarity. This matches a pattern the rest of the evidence has been pointing toward, that the monitoring system and the reasoning system are separable even within the prefrontal cortex itself. What lucid dreaming demonstrates is that the prefrontal cortex can come back online during REM without ending the dream. The hallucinated world keeps running. The amygdala stays engaged. The visual cortex keeps processing. But the monitoring function, the system that tags experience as internally or externally generated and that can evaluate what is happening, becomes partially functional again. The dreamer exists in two registers at once. There is the register of the dream itself, vivid and immediate, and there is the register of awareness that the dream is a dream, which is clear and reflective. The two coexist. The lucid dream also raises a question about the emotional system's role in what dreaming feels like. Lucid dreamers report that becoming aware of the dream does not, on its own, diminish the emotional reality of what they are experiencing. A lucid dreamer caught in a threatening scenario knows the threat is not real and is still afraid. The amygdala does not update its response when the prefrontal cortex comes back online. The knowledge and the fear run in parallel rather than one correcting the other. This is a significant finding for understanding why emotional processing during REM does not depend on the prefrontal cortex's participation. The processing happens at a subcortical level and is not interrupted by partial prefrontal reactivation. The emotions are not symptoms of ignorance, they are independent events. This is one of the most precise demonstrations that the dreaming system and the waking monitoring system are separable. They can be uncoupled and they can be partially recoupled without either collapsing. The dream runs on a different substrate than the awareness of the dream. Under the right conditions, both can run at the same time. What runs during REM is not a single process, but a convergence of them. The brainstem fires the signal, the cortex builds the world, the amygdala marks what matters, the hippocampus supplies the material. Above all of this, the prefrontal cortex goes quiet, allowing the rest to run with fewer constraints than it would normally permit. The findings behind each of them have been replicated across decades of work. What has not been settled is whether the dream that emerges from this convergence has a single function. Not everything that runs during the dream is understood. The most significant unresolved question is whether dreaming has a single function at all. The evidence points to at least three candidates: threat rehearsal, emotional memory processing, and creative association. These are not obviously the same thing. A brain rehearsing physical danger is not obviously doing the same thing as a brain gradually reducing the emotional charge on a difficult memory, or the same thing as a brain forming novel connections between distantly related concepts. The question of whether these are three facets of one underlying mechanism or three separate things that happen to occur during the same physiological state has not been settled. One way to think about this is to ask whether the neurochemical state of REM is itself what matters, and the specific outputs of that state are secondary to the conditions it creates. The near-total absence of norepinephrine is the consistent feature. What that absence enables is a loosening of the constraints that govern waking cognition. Less filtering, less reality monitoring, and less tight coupling between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. A brain in that state will naturally process emotionally significant material differently and form more distant associations and synthesize experience without checking it against external reality. These may not be three separate programs running in parallel. They may be three consequences of one underlying condition, running simultaneously because the condition produces them all at once. There is also the question of forgetting. The overwhelming majority of dreams are not remembered. A person who sleeps for 8 hours moves through several complete REM cycles, experiencing what the brain produces in each of them. Most of it is gone before waking. Almost all of it is gone within minutes of waking. The mechanisms by which some dreams get transferred into waking memory while most do not are only partially understood. One account holds that waking during or immediately after REM is necessary for encoding, and that the brain chemistry of REM is itself inhospitable to long-term memory formation. But the consistent experience of some people who report rich, detailed dream recall, alongside the equal consistency of people who report remembering almost nothing, suggests something more individual is operating, and what that is remains unclear. Non-human animals raise the same questions in a more compressed form. REM sleep is present in nearly all mammals and has been identified in most birds. The structural features of REM in mammals appear across species with enough consistency to suggest the state is very old. PGO waves have been recorded in cats and in rodents. Motor atonia and aminergic demodulation follow the same basic pattern across the mammalian class. The common ancestor of all modern mammals is estimated to have had REM sleep roughly 200 million years ago. What this means for dreaming is not clear. Rats whose hippocampal place cells fire in specific patterns during maze navigation show those same patterns reactivating during subsequent REM sleep. Something that resembles rehearsal or replay appears to occur. Whether that replay is experienced, whether there is something it feels like to be a dreaming rat, is not a question neuroscience currently has a method to answer. NREM sleep also generates experience. The mentation reported from slow-wave sleep is different from REM dreams. It is less visual and more conceptual, less narrative, and more like a thought than a scene. Whether this constitutes dreaming in the same sense, and what if anything it is for, is debated. The framework built around REM and its neurochemistry does not straightforwardly account for experience that occurs when none of that chemistry is operating. The dreaming brain may be more than one brain. The deepest question, and the one least likely to be resolved by the methods currently available, is the question of experience itself. Activation synthesis and its successors describe what the brain is doing when it dreams. They describe which signals fire, which regions activate, and what the timing looks like. What they do not describe, what no neuroscientific account has yet described, is why any of this produces something that feels like anything. The process of cortical synthesis could theoretically run without generating vivid conscious experience. The fact that it does generate vivid conscious experience, that the dream is not merely a series of neural events but a felt world, is not explained by knowing which regions are active or which molecules are present. This is not a failure of dream neuroscience specifically. It is the hard problem of consciousness, applied to its most accessible and internally coherent manifestation. The dream is, in a way, the most direct evidence we have that subjective experience is real. Every morning, You wake from a world that was generated inside you and felt entirely like a world. The mechanism that generated it is increasingly well understood. The fact that it was experienced is not. Tonight, when you sleep, something is going to happen to a handful of cells at the base of your brain. The breaking chemistry that held them back all day will begin to ease. Norepinephrine will fall, serotonin will fall, and in the quiet that follows, acetylcholine will surge through the brainstem, and the dream machinery will open. Your body will become still, your eyes will move, and a pulse of electrical activity will rise from the oldest part of your brain through a relay that ordinarily serves your eyes, reaching all the way to the visual cortex at the back of your skull. The cortex will receive that signal and do what it always does. It will build the best world it can from what arrives. You will not know any of this. You will be inside the world it builds, and it will be real. Someone will speak to you in it. You will move through a place you know or almost know. Something will happen that carries weight. The amygdala running behind the scene will make certain of that. The monitoring system that would ordinarily tell you this is happening inside your own mind will be offline, and so you will not tell yourself. You will simply be there. What the dream is doing underneath the experience of it is something researchers are still working out. The same neurochemical state that runs it could be doing several things at once. Multiple functions could be running through the same process without any of them being aware of the others. The brainstem does not know what it is doing. The cortex does not know what it is building. The dreamer does not know they are dreaming. And yet this asymmetry runs only one direction. The waking mind knows about the dream. It knows the mechanism and can watch the chemistry begin to shift as sleep approaches. The dreaming mind knows nothing of the waking world. It has no concept of itself as a dream. The machinery that would generate that concept is offline. The world the dream builds is, from the inside, the only world there is. There is no margin in it for the knowledge that it has a source and a destination. What you know, lying there in the moment just before sleep, is something none of the dreaming system knows. You know that the world about to begin is constructed. You know where the machinery is. You know the chemistry that starts it, and the path the signal takes, and the regions that come alive, and the one that goes quiet. You know that the experience that follows is built from you, from your concerns and your memories, and the particular emotional charge of what you have been living, assembled by a cortex doing its best with noise. None of that knowledge will be available to you inside the dream. The brain that holds it now is not the brain that dreams. But when the light comes back and the room reasserts itself, the brain that returns will carry something the dreaming brain could not. It will know that something happened there. The emotional residue of what was dreamed may arrive before the memory of it does, a feeling of something unresolved, or the particular lightness that follows a dream that ended well, reaches the waking mind before the images do, that a world was made out of a handful of cells firing in the dark, and that where it came from, and what it might have been for, is no longer entirely a mystery. If something here stayed with you, a like helps more people find it. And if something here sparked a question or a thought you want to follow, leave it in the comments. I would be glad to hear it.